Good morning. My name is Tony Robinson, president of Beacon Editorial, and I'm here today to interview Thomas Allen Moon, the author of the book Payback: Why the Top 1% Must Invest in the Rest, and How That Can Renew America. Mr. Moon, please tell us why you wrote this book.
I'm one of the luckiest people on the planet. I happened to be born at the right time, 1943, and I came of age in about the early 1960s. During that period of time, and throughout most of my life, America has prospered as never before, and more people were able to live the American dream than ever in the history of this country or any other country. But now I see storm clouds on the horizon, and I'm terrified that my children's generation and grandchildren's generation won't have the same opportunity that I had. And so I thought that by writing this book and sharing some of the information and knowledge that I've learned over the last 40 years, that might help.
Okay, so please tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to write this book.
First of all, my background is as an attorney. And when I graduated law school, I never had any idea that I would end up as something called a public finance attorney. It was an odd set of circumstances that led to that. And from 1980 through probably 2010, I practiced public finance law, in which we did all kinds of financings in public-private partnerships. And virtually all of those financings were dependent upon the use of one benefit or another, one tax benefit, what we now call tax preferences. And initially I thought those tax preferences were just fine because I made a very good income exploiting them or using them. Nothing illegal about that whatsoever. But after practicing that type of law for a while, it became apparent to me that tax preferences do very little good for anyone other than the people who are the direct beneficiaries of it, and the lawyers and the investment bankers and commercial bankers and other people who package these deals. We got a pretty good income out of that. But the more time I spent in that area, the less benefit I saw to the general public for the use of those.
So could you give us an example of a few tax preferences?
Tax preferences fall into two broad categories. One, the expenditures that both individuals and businesses make. Those expenditures that the politicians decide to favor, they can grant either credits or deductions for those types of expenditures. So that means that if people or businesses buy certain types of products or certain types of goods, or they spend their money in a given way, they get a tax benefit for it. But people who spend their money the way they choose that doesn't happen to have a tax benefit associated with it, they simply pay higher taxes. So people who spend their money the way the government tells them to spend it, they get a tax benefit. Those who spend the money the way they want to, even if the government doesn't, they don't get a tax benefit. And I, with the passage of time, cannot justify that in my own mind. Now then, the second type of tax preference, or the second broad category, is how income is treated. People don't really realize this, but there's really only one kind of income. Every dollar spends the same, but how you make your dollar depends on how it gets taxed. Wage income is very simple. Everybody gets taxed on that. But capital income, that is the return on investments of one kind or another, that income is taxed much differently and usually at much lower rates, and sometimes it's not even taxed at all. So it's been difficult for me to understand why a wage earner always has to pay taxes on every dollar of income they get. But on the other hand, people who live off of capital income investments, sometimes they don't pay tax at all, and sometimes they pay tax at a much lower rate than wage earners do. So those are the two basic categories of tax preferences, and the more I've had experience with it and thought about it, I can't justify them.
Of course, you use the word payback in the title of your book, and you state that you want to pay back America for what it has given you. What would you say America has given you?
America has given me a good life, an opportunity to live the American dream in the sense that I was able to rise as high, maybe even higher than my talent would take me, and put my kids through college, have a good middle-class standard of living, and have decent health care all of my life. So I've been fortunate, and I think that the same opportunities I've had should be provided to everybody.
Now, when you talk about eliminating tax preferences in your book and tax reform, are you talking about redistribution?
Yes, I am, and I talk about it sadly because I was hearkening back to when I began my career in the early 60s. At that time, income disparities and wealth disparities were much narrower. People could have a far better chance of fending for themselves. Even people who had little education above the high school level could earn a good living and didn't need a lot of help from the government. I knew people who had a high school degree or high school diploma, and they were able to build small businesses, or everything from policemen to barbers to plumbers, whatever. They were able to earn enough income, enough market income, that they didn't need a lot of help from the government. But I noticed that today, because of globalization and automation, fewer and fewer people are able to earn a market income in which they can pretty much fend for themselves. So if people can't fend for themselves but are still willing to work hard, I think they deserve better than a market income that leaves them with, in some instances, little more than subsistence wages.
So how do you reconcile free market capitalism with redistribution and saving the middle class, as which you talk about so often in the book?
Well, I can give a classic example. One of the leading conservative thinkers, Milton Friedman, understood this a long time ago, back in the 50s and 60s and 70s, before the problem became as serious as it is now. And he recommended a negative income tax that was intended to narrow the gap between the wealthy and the poor. He understood that some jobs might not pay enough market wage. And so he said, well, we will, in essence, take tax resources and give them back money even if they didn't earn it. That was a way of mitigating the wealth disparities. Now, when he wrote that back in the, like I say, the 60s or so, the situation's gotten far worse. And so the only way that I would want to use redistribution is if too few jobs provide enough income for people to live for hardworking people to live a middle-class standard of living, at the same time provide for their own retirement, provide for their health care, and provide for the post-secondary education of their children. Sadly, to me, fewer and fewer people are able to do that.
Let's get a little bit more specific here for a moment. The 96 Tax Reform Act,
You mean the
excuse me,
86?
the 1986 Tax Reform Act eliminated some tax preferences, but a lot of them have come back and they seem to be a problem again. What's your take on that?
Well, I was actively engaged in the practice of law in 1986. And the law firm that I was with, and many other law firms, and many people, particularly in the real estate business, lived off of these tax preferences. And there's no business more permeated with tax preferences than the real estate business. And I did a lot of deals through the use of tax-exempt bonds with real estate developers to build all kinds of real estate facilities. And the Tax Reform Act of 1986 showed just how pernicious many of these tax benefits are, because the Reform Act took away those benefits. They killed many tax preferences on which the real estate industry thrived, and which the municipal bond industry, of which I was a part, was dependent upon. And in the wake of the 86 law, many law firms fell apart. My income as an attorney in those days took a 50% cut or more, and law firms were threatened. The whole tax shelter industry was devastated. But what we learned as a result of that was that many of these commercial real estate projects that were financed through all these tax benefits wouldn't stand the market test. Take away the benefits, and many of them were not viable. I can still remember that many of these projects went through foreclosure. Even some shopping centers that were built were bulldozed because the theory was, build it and they will come. Well, they were built and nobody came. And many of those distortions arose because of tax preferences, which distorted the market. Had the market mechanisms worked properly, there wouldn't have been those projects financed in the beginning. The only way they got financing was through tax preferences.
Well, what do you say to those who call a proposal to eliminate tax proposals as a radical proposal?
Well, ridding the tax code of tax preferences is a radical proposal only in the sense that it would end probably 50 or 60 years of tax preferences or meddling in the tax code by people who personally benefit from it. And their personal benefit has the effect of distorting markets. It distorts capitalism. It moves investments from one type of investment that the market would dictate to an investment dictated by these tax preferences. That's political intervention in the marketplace. So what I learned is that there's something to Adam Smith. Let markets work without government meddling. And tax preferences represent government meddling on a grand scale, and oftentimes the government meddling concentrates income in the wrong hands, namely people who benefit from political influence, and it costs the general public. So the general public pays for these, and that, in my judgment, has contributed substantially to the undue concentration of wealth and income in this country.
So what you're saying is a true free market capitalism is one which has actually been endorsed by people who would be called conservative economists or politicians, and it is one that is not interfered by with things like tax preferences. Is that correct?
Well, sure. I'll give an example. Several years ago, I forgot which presidential campaign it was. I think it was either 1996 or 2000, somewhere in that range. Steve Forbes, a millionaire or billionaire, a guy who inherited his wealth from his father, Malcolm Forbes, he came out with something called a flat tax. Well, now the flat tax was great in one sense. His idea was we'll just eliminate all the tax preferences and greatly reduce rates. Well, that worked. The only problem with his proposal was it was a flat tax in which the rich and poor, the richest guy and the poorest guy paid the same 15% tax rate. And that doesn't work. In order to have a proper distribution of income, there has to be a graduated income tax rate, which has been traditional since the income tax was put into place early in the 20th century. But nevertheless, his idea was a conservative idea. Get the government out of making all these decisions that allocate or misallocate capital. So in that sense, I think getting rid of tax preferences is a sound conservative idea. And I might also note that the 1986 Tax Reform Act, that was signed by Ronald Reagan, one of the leading conservative presidents in this country. Indeed. And that 86 Act did away with many, not enough, but many tax preferences, and I think the country was better off for it.
Let's back out a little bit here again and kind of generally look at the book. What features of this book do you think will be most useful to people?
Well, first of all, I try and show people that the middle class is having a tough time, and I try and explain why. It's globalization and automation. Those are economic forces that no one is going to turn back. I don't care what the politicians say, globalization and automation are here to stay. Now, if capitalism, and that would be intruding into capitalism, because what's led to automation and globalization is capitalism. And capitalism has created more wealth than any economic system could possibly create. So my view of it is, let capitalism rip and roar, but realize that if it does, there's going to be a maldistribution of income. Some people are going to be big winners and some people are going to be big losers, and that's where the government has to intervene through redistribution to make sure that capitalists can still get rich and still do very well, but people who are simply wage earners, that they will still have a decent job, still have a decent retirement, still have adequate health care, and still have their kids go to get the post-secondary education they need. So my tax policies are designed to try and accommodate capitalism on the one hand, but on the other hand, make sure that America has a thriving middle class and the American dream is being made available to more and more people rather than fewer and fewer.
Is it true that you are offering your book completely free of charge to the public?
Sure it is. If I tried to charge, nobody would pay for it. I wrote it as penance. I did the tax-driven deals, taking advantage of tax preferences that made me a good living for many years and put my kids through college for that matter. But I've come to this late in life like St. Augustine. Chastity, but not now, he said. Well, I've come to this realization late in my career, so as my penance for having done these deals, and because I'm grateful for the life that America's given me, I thought I would share my knowledge with the public. Hopefully someone will read it, and hopefully it will attract the attention of politicians who will decide, you know, maybe it's time for patriotism as opposed to benefiting the people who elect me.
I'd like to hear, kind of in conclusion, to try to sum up for our listeners what I think is the main argument of your book. Number one, the American middle class is the backbone of the U.S. economy. Number two, In the last 30 to 40 years, globalization, technology, and what you call the iron law of wages have combined to threaten the health and the long-term prosperity of the middle class. Number three, capitalism, as long as it is unfettered by tax preferences, is still the best system to create wealth and economic opportunity. Number four, tax reform through intervention by the federal government is required to end the corrupting influence of tax preferences and help rebalance the economy and provide social welfare and equal opportunity for all. And number five, the AmeriShare tax plan, as outlined in your book, is a proposal for restructuring and simplifying the U.S. tax system and restoring the primacy of the middle class.
Tony, those are the issues that I discussed, and they're out there for all to read in my book. But if you like, I'll be glad to tackle them one by one and give a capsule version of what I mean. So if you'll take the first one on the middle class. Sure, the middle class is the backbone of any society. It's the backbone of this country. I'm a product of the middle class. My children and grandchildren hopefully will spend their lives in the middle class. And I'll go back for a moment into antiquity. Aristotle said a society needs to be healthy, it needs a thriving middle class, because if you have simply rich people at the top, they will worry about everybody else trying to take their money. If you have too many poor people at the bottom, they will be preoccupied with trying to get money from the rich, and you will have forever social tension. If you have a large middle class and everyone feels that they have access to entry into the middle class and a chance to stay there if they work hard, that's the best way to have a healthy society. And I've lived through America in its most prosperous times, and I desperately hope that my children will be able to say, and grandchildren will be able to say the same.
We talked about globalization, technology, and the iron law of wages and how those are kind of unavoidable. And so how do you feel?
I'd like to comment on that. Let's take first globalization. A world in which the world competes with each other is a good world, because economic competition is healthy for everyone. Competition itself is healthy. There is no progress in the world if a person who finds a better way doesn't have a chance of taking advantage of that better way of doing something. Everybody can build a better mousetrap. If a better mousetrap is built anywhere in the world and it's made available to the world in general, that's a world that's going to get wealthier. It's a world in which everybody's going to prosper more. But what it does is it puts a great deal of pressure on every society to work as hard as they can. And I think that's a good thing, not a bad thing. If you try and insulate people from competition, that's a one-way ticket to disaster, because people get fat, lazy, happy, and they're not as productive as they should be.
Well, and of course, also after World War II, America pushed international trade as one way to help heal the world and promote economic prosperity.
Sure, I would rather trade with China than trade bullets with China. Trade economically with China rather than trade bullets with China, and the same for the rest of the world. And frankly, we have all the advantages in this country to have a workforce second to none if we take advantage of it. We have plenty of raw material to work with. If we educate our children and grandchildren, we'll be just fine. We'll compete. We'll outcompete virtually every other society as we have. Secondly, automation and technology. There's no turning that back. If you could turn that back, the Luddites in the 19th century England would have stopped the looms from working.
No, it never worked.
Computers
trying to stop it.
Computers, all we would have to do is pass a law saying, well, you can't use bulldozers. That's got to be done manually. Right. So we're not going to go back. We're not going to reverse automation. That's here to stay. But what do both automation and globalization have to do with the iron law of wages, for example? The iron law of wages is a 19th century law that says, economic law, that says that anytime a labor pool grows faster than the demand for it, the wages of those in that labor pool have to go down. That's a simple principle. The more supply and the less demand, then prices have to go down, and so it is with labor. Now, because capitalists now have the ability to roam the world and find the lowest cost labor, that puts great pressure on wages in this country. So it means that if you can find someone who can do the work in India or wherever better and cheaper than it can be done here, then that means that fewer people in this country will be employed in that industry, and the ranks of those who have just ordinary plain skills will grow, and as those ranks grow and there's less demand for people with ordinary skills, those wages have got to fall. So that's
Well,
simply...
and obviously American workers can't compete with people in another country who are paid 1/3, for example, or 1/2 what they are.
Well, that's why automation and technology come in hand in hand. In order to have a job in the world that's developing, you're going to have skills. It's not enough to say, I'll work hard for you, because you can work hard and accomplish very little if you don't have any skill. So it'll be a very skills-oriented place. And it'll get even more chancy, because as artificial intelligence and automation becomes more prevalent even than it is now, that means that fewer people, more and more people will have their jobs displaced and join that pool of ordinary workers. And because that pool may grow faster than the demand for ordinary workers, wages are bound to be suppressed, hence the iron law of wages. So that's why I believe that the market wages of a number of people in this country who have ordinary skills are bound to either stagnate or in some instances decline. And that's why I believe that we need government intervention to try and deal with that. If we tried to undo it by destroying capitalism, by saying, well, we'll just build barriers, we'll restrict automation and we'll restrict globalization, all that will do is make us poor in the long run. So in order
Well,
to...
and it hasn't worked in the past
And
either.
it wouldn't work anyway. You can't
Yeah.
build barriers to that sort of thing. So because globalization, automation plays such a tremendous role in the economy today, I think that it's essential, if we want to preserve the middle class, to recognize that and deal with it straightforwardly.
Okay. So the AmeriShare tax plan, as outlined in your book, is essentially a proposal for greatly simplifying the U.S. tax system.
Sure, the AmeriShare tax program in a nutshell is get rid of virtually all tax preferences, tax all income the same, and set up a progressive tax structure. And let me give an example about how that progressive tax structure would work. To me, it is unconscionable to tax someone to the extent that their income would fall below, let's just be arbitrary, 125% of the poverty level. And on the other hand, not tax someone who has billions of income. Now, I don't want to do anything to destroy the incentive of billionaires to create new jobs, new industries, and so forth. But I believe that they can pay substantially more taxes than they're paying now before we should tax people whose income is only 125% of poverty. You can barely live a middle-class standard of living with that kind of an income, and to tax them and then have to turn around and make it up with food stamps, with various kinds of subsidy programs, more higher education subsidies.
That was Friedman's point, wasn't
Well,
it?
that was
Yeah.
his point, and I think it's a valid point. Again, that's a conservative point of view, and I find myself sharing that view.
Well, I think it's practical. It's not just conservative.
Why tax someone into poverty and then have to turn around and have a bunch of federal programs to drag them out of poverty?
Right.
To me, it makes no sense.
I agree. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Moon, for your time. It's been very enlightening, and we look forward to your book on the World Wide Web, and free to all who choose to read it.
Well, my hope is that people will read it and get something out of it, and my even greater hope is that people will learn enough to put some pressure on the politicians to give us a tax law that is simple, more progressive, and also that if they're going to redistribute income, other than making the tax law more progressive, I think that they should do it directly through increased social insurance targeted to help only those in need. I don't believe in raising and creating social insurance that rewards those who are not needy. I believe social insurance should be reserved for the needy, and particularly when it comes to post-secondary education. I received the GI Bill benefits myself, and I've seen other people receive those type of benefits. If it were up to me, I would treat aid to colleges and universities and post-secondary education as an underwriting matter. If you have people who are willing to work for it, then they should get help from the government. If, on the other hand, their desire is simply to hang around the campus for 5 or 6 years, enjoying a college life, well, then I'm not for that. Right. They would get no money under my program, but for those who are willing to make the best of it, they would get the help they need.
Well, as you say, too, the more that the general public can be educated about taxes and how they work and preferences and the need for reform, the better chance the public has of putting pressure on the politicians to make the changes.
Well, I'll put it this way as politely as I can. If the general public knew what I know, they would be infuriated.
I think they are infuriated. They just don't understand all the ins and outs of the tax
Yes,
system.
I don't think they know how to channel their fury.
Yes.
So what my book will help people understand is where to channel their fury.
Very good. Thank you.